Welcome to Meaningful Work Matters. I'm Andrew Soren. In this episode, I'm joined by Jennifer Tosti-Kharas and Christopher Wong Michaelson, co-authors of two books, Is Your Work Worth It?, as well as The Meaning and Purpose of Work. Jennifer is a management professor at Babson College, and Christopher is a business ethicist at the University of St. Thomas and on the faculty of NYU. Together, they've spent years exploring what makes work meaningful and the risks and rewards of treating work as a calling. What makes this conversation special is that Jen and Christopher bring different lenses. She's a psychologist, he's a philosopher. Their collaboration is both a partnership and at times a spirited debate. We talk about whether meaning is defined by individuals or by objective standards, whether work adds to the good life or distracts from it, and what organizations truly owe their people. Along the way, you'll hear stories you won't want to miss, from what 9/11 taught us about how we remember people through their work, to the surprising lessons of office space and how AI might reshape our relationship with work. This episode is a three-way dialogue that will leave you reflecting on your own relationship with work and why it matters. Welcome to the Meaningful Work Matters podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Soren, founder of Eudaimonic by Design. On this podcast, we'll dive into the world of meaningful work, explore its complexities, and examine its impact on people and the organizations they're a part of. Each episode features insightful conversations with cutting-edge experts who are successfully navigating the challenges of meaningful work. We hope to offer you ideas, frameworks, and tools to unlock potential and design work that's fulfilling, impactful, and supports everyone's well-being. Subscribe or follow us now, and let's make meaningful work matter. Christopher and Jen, welcome to Meaningful Work Matters. I'm really excited for this conversation today. I've been deep in reading a few of your recent books, two specifically, but one that's called Meaning and Purpose of Work, which recently came out, which I'm so excited to speak about with you today. And we'll talk about your other one, Is Your Work Worth It, a little bit later. But maybe before we do any of that, maybe we can just start with you guys telling us a little bit about who you are and what makes your work meaningful.
Who am I? I just had my birthday yesterday, and so
Happy birthday.
Thank you. The reason that I mentioned that is that my kids all made me cards, and they really zeroed in on how I am not just professionally a philosopher, but I am, I guess, just personally a philosopher. And so that's for better or worse. I'm always getting my kids to think more deeply about why they do, what's a good life, and so on. And I hope that that's ultimately a very good thing. So I also am a former management consultant, and that informs my thinking a lot about meaningful work. Not only because, as I'm sure we'll get into in the conversation, that maybe the most seminal historical event, the 9/11 terrorist attacks, happened while I was fully in management consulting, but soon to transition into an academic career. And I think there's a connection there. But also because I understand how the working world works. And I often say I would never go back to management consulting full time, but I am forever grateful for having had that experience to inform what work is, what it can be, and how I think about it now as a writer, scholar, and teacher.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Not all management consultants, even those of us who are recovering ones, are evil. It's great to be able to have you here. Jen, how about you?
Okay, so fellow former management consultant, recovering management consultant, also living and working in New York City when 9/11 happened, the 9/11 attacks and their aftermath and what it meant for how we remembered the victims in terms of their work and what it meant is something Christopher and I have studied together. But from there, our paths kind of do diverge because he may be a philosopher to the core. I am an organizational psychologist by training. 9/11 did mark for me a shift back to get my PhD, make a career change, become a professor, scholar, teacher. And I was lucky enough when I was getting my PhD at NYU to work with Amy Resnesky, who is, I think, someone who's talked about a lot on this podcast, but to have her as a mentor was fantastic and really set me then on this path of studying work as a calling and meaningful work. And then today, Christopher, you didn't say what you do today, apart from you're a philosopher to the core. But so he's a business ethics professor at the University of St. Thomas in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I am a management professor. I teach a lot of organizational behavior classes at Babson College just outside of Boston. What makes my work meaningful has always been the teaching side and sort of that immediate gratification of seeing students' lives transformed by, in the best case of what I do, students' lives transformed. I think writing a book so Andrew, as you said, we wrote 2 books that came out within a year's time. One is more focused on anyone who works, and one is more focused on an academic conversation. I think that's the one you're going to start with. But just this opportunity when we wrote the book that is more outward, broad focused, we really wanted to help working people think about the big questions in their work. And so that's like an emerging meaningful area for me, I would say, is actually broadening out beyond having scholarly conversations, direct conversations with my students, and sort of this kind of broader, I feel this sort of broader pull to help ambitiously anyone who works think differently about the work they do.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much. When I originally had this idea for this particular episode, it was because of some of the work that I had read around ethics specifically, in the way that that both of you have thought deeply about what the ethics of meaningful work actually is. And I suggested we had a conversation about that. And Christopher, you came back and was like, well, maybe we can have more of a debate. And not least of which, because of the fact that the two of you represent very different perspectives. I mean, you have shared background, shared passion, shared meaning, but you also approach this from very different perspectives, which is what I think makes your book so interesting. So maybe let's start with a debate when it comes to understanding meaningful work. Which is more important, psychology or philosophy? Jen, you get to go first.
Definitely psychology. This is all we need to know. No. And so the thing I wanted to say was because of working with Christopher, I now consider myself, if I may, and people use the term armchair psychologist, I consider myself an armchair philosopher. I've gotten so much more, as much as I want to help people, as I said previously. The psychologist's way of doing that is often through trying to find, some evidence-based um, solutions. What's going to work? What's going to be linked with outcomes that we can point to in an empirical way to help people through that? And, kind of diagnosing, testing, solving. I think through the work with Christopher, I've become so much more open to we don't all have to have the answers or pretend to have the answers. We can be really comfortable framing the right questions. And sometimes framing the right questions is enough. And that's something I think would not have necessarily come to had we not started our collaboration. I think in terms of how our understanding of meaningful work differs, and let me just say diplomatically complements each other. So rather than what's more important, I mean, I wish more scholars would go outside of their disciplinary boundaries and engage in dialogue with others, because I do think we're in management, broad field. We're not in psychology, philosophy. So this is an interdisciplinary field. And yet, all too often, people stay in their silos, which has something to do with their training, where they publish, and then their methods, and then they just sort of stay in that lane. So where I think our differences show up is that I still default to the nature of the meaningful work resides in the head of the person doing it, basically. So we could be working and this is informed by my training by Amy, which is all about work orientation, and that you and I could be in the same job, same role, same, whatever, same organization, and you feel your work is, sometimes we say just a job, you're in it for the money. I feel my work is a calling. And that's because we are construing our own unique perspective on the work. And so no one can really tell us what our work orientation is. We figure that out for ourselves. But then through Christopher, I've gotten a lot more comfortable with the notion that, well, we can be wrong about, I'll let him say more about this, but we can be wrong about what our work, whether our work is meaningful. And that there maybe is a more objective perspective on this question of what is meaningful work to complement, again, not an either or, but I think a complement to our understanding of what is meaningful work. With that, I will let Christopher jump in.
I love going second in a debate because Jen said so many things that I want to pick up on. First of all, Andrew, I want to say I don't remember exactly what I said on email, but I don't know if I framed it as a debate. But I love that you've reframed it in that way because we are collaborators. One thing that Jen said had to do with the value of framing questions. And I think we live very much in a world that is obsessed with all the answers that especially brain science gives about ourselves and in a sense our physically determined way of thinking. And I would like to think, not all philosophers think this way, but I would like to think as a philosopher that we still have free will, that we are not in the cages of our brains, and that we can ask perfect questions without ever getting to final answers. So I wish that our world valued questions more than answers that we like to pretend are certain that aren't always certain. Um, just as Jen is an honorary armchair philosopher, I would like to say that I consider myself now an honorary social scientist that actually gets his hands dirty in data. Jen mentioned our 9/11 research, which was our first research collaboration. And quite frankly, I couldn't have done that project without Jen, which is why it was an idea for several years until I met Jen and talked with her about this project, and we ended up working on it together. So this debate is really not much of a debate at all, Andrew. We really are collaborators. As Jen said, social scientists often think about meaningful work in a subjective sense. Does it feel meaningful to me? Then it is. And in one paper that I sole authored, I say that there is a subjective definition of meaningful work, there is a social definition of meaningful work, and those are usually the two that are contrasted. So a subjective definition of what feels meaningful to me, a social definition is what is of value to society. And I add a third dimension, which is really ineffable, which so I say that meaningful work is, it ought to be meaningful to me, meaning it would be nice if it felt meaningful. It ought to be meaningful to others. It would be nice if they valued it. But it must be meaningful in itself. What does that mean? Well, that means in some platonic way that there is a form of meaningful work that all meaningful work must conform to. And so, as Jen said, we can be wrong about whether our work is meaningful. The example that we often use is that the 9/11 terrorists thought that they were doing meaningful work, and they weren't. I have no trouble saying objectively they were wrong about that. But maybe a more relatable example is a story that we tell in the book is about a team of management consultants who were trying to make their work more meaningful by simply delegating it to other people lower than they were on the value chain. And all that did was make their work more pleasant and make other people's work more unpleasant. And I don't necessarily think that that fulfills an objective standard of meaningful work.
There's a word that you used a little bit earlier in that statement, what work ought to be, what meaningful work ought to be. And I mean, to me, this is the incredible thing about the intersection between psychology and philosophy. I think that psychologists, at least in my experience, and in full transparency, I don't have a PhD. I'm both an armchair psychologist and an armchair philosopher, and a fake academic in all sorts of ways who's just really, interested in making sure that we approach the practice of these aspects with integrity and trying to lean on all of the kinds of inquiries that both of you ask and that all the scholars who come onto this program ask. But one of the things that I think I recognize about this field is that psychology generally is much more descriptive. It tries to veer away quite definitively from prescribing what should happen, and philosophy is much more interested in thinking about oughts and what should potentially happen, and the more that I have wrestled with meaningful work, the more that I think, without being willing to engage with those oughts, we can run into some really big risks. And so maybe that's maybe a next place that we can go is does work actually provide meaning in our lives, or does work get in the way of meaning in our lives?
Well, I was thinking about a talk that I gave recently at a company about meaningful work. And I think, Andrew, the way that you distinguish psychology from philosophy is versus ought is a very conventional way that I agree with, is how our fields complement each other. And when I was talking with the workers in this company, they were often talking about how what makes their work meaningful, number one, is relationships with each other. And that's wonderful. And I think that's an is and an ought. And that's something that we should strive for in our workplaces. But those relationships with each other are predicated on working toward a common goal. And that's the ultimate goal of, the existence of their corporation. And that's where they started to have some second thoughts about what is the ultimate goal. So obviously we often talk about the goal of a corporation being to make a profit, but they weren't only talking about that. They were also talking about the kinds of products and services that they sold. And some of them were better than others, meaning they were better for the lives of their customers than others. And so it was easier for them, as they thought more deeply about it, to think about the work that actually, might improve the life of a customer, the health of a customer, as ultimately meaningful in a sense that work that simply provided hedonic pleasure for a customer would be. So I guess to answer your question more directly, I think that when we serve those ultimate goods, work can be one of the greatest contributions we make. And we spend so much time making that contribution, we might as well make a meaningful contribution. But all too often, as we all know, work takes it away.
Hmm. Jen, would you add anything?
Not a lot to add. I think Christopher covered that very nicely. The answer is always it depends. So I wish that we were at a place. I think the reason that we have this cultural conversation about work should be meaningful, it should be a calling, is because there is this trend toward knowledge work and jobs that are, by all accounts, pretty good. They're well paid. They have a lot of autonomy. You get to do kind of interesting work. And maybe in the process, as Christopher is saying, there's some broader framing to what the organization is trying to accomplish. That's hopefully not just like a spin on a vision statement, but is really, I mean, and Andrew, I think that's in your work, what you're helping companies do. What's the real meaningful end here? But I think the reality is there are so many people in our world whose daily lives are very far from that knowledge work kind of freedom and flexibility, and whose jobs probably are what we would consider drudgery. They're bad jobs. They may feel meaningless. They may feel like, I know you referenced David Graeber, bullshit jobs. And so by it would be so great if we were in a place where everyone had the kind of work that at least could be meaningful. And I think we are far from that place. And I wish that we had more. I wish that meaningful work and this conversation didn't feel like more of a luxury.
Jen, let me kind of carry on that point. So you've referenced Amy Wrzesniewski, you've referenced job career calling and work orientation theory. So this idea that work can be many different things for us. Sometimes it can just be a job. Sometimes it can be about status and climbing a ladder. Sometimes it can be a calling and an absolute passion. Would be my oversimplification of work orientation theory. But when I have conversations about this with people, and you just named it, it feels a kind of a privilege to be able to talk about work orientation theory for so many, especially given the context that so many jobs. I mean, there's data from the Brookings Institute that says about 43% of the U.S. population has jobs that earn them in that job less than $20,000 a year. I mean, that's like literally impossible to live on $20,000 a year in a North American context, which means that you have multiple jobs, which means that you're part of the Alice population and you're working poor. It's to approach that context and say, hey, this is, your job should be a calling, feels almost an affront. So I'm curious, for those of us who work in the space of meaningful work, what's our responsibility about going to people and saying, hey, you should work for love as opposed to like the love of what you do versus you should like it's great to be able to have a paycheck so that you can go and do what you love outside of work.
Yeah. I think part of our goal in this in both of our books is to take that pressure off people because we see it also in our students who are again privileged, getting a higher education at, elite institutions in the US. And who feel a crushing pressure that like if I haven't figured out what my passion is, if I don't know what my calling is, am I already lost? Have I already done it wrong? And the reality could not be farther from the truth. So by no means, I mean, my research, others has found that calling is, well, Stuart Bunderson and Jeff Thompson say this, a very powerful double-edged sword. So even when our work is a calling, for example, we can do things that don't necessarily make our lives better, like leave money on the table, open ourselves to exploitation, have strained relationships with our supervisors and our coworkers. We can be difficult to work with, unyielding in our dedication to our work, unable to disengage with it from it that then affects our, psychological and physical health and well-being, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, we'd love for no one's work to be meaningless. So this maybe gets back to what is our responsibility? I think acknowledging, as we do in the book, that the this is a question that does require some privilege, some assumption of choice over work. I mean, even to engage in a conversation about job crafting, assume some level of autonomy, choice, freedom, and flexibility around one's work role that not everyone has. And so, going back to, I mean, I think if I can talk a little bit about our 9/11 studies and what we found there about hopefully elevating the work of when work is a job, we shouldn't consider it just a job. This is a way that many people feel that the money they earn then helps their family, their life outside of work. They're giving back in some way to the community in their free time because of the what their work provides. So just this notion that it has to be a calling and that's the only way to have a meaningful life. It is one way. And we certainly wouldn't want people to feel like their work is meaningless or is obviously harming them. And there are so many jobs that are like that. And that's something we as a society need to think about, I think, a lot. But I think our goal as researchers and as people who are trying to get the word out about the complexity of what it means to experience meaningful work. It really is a much more complicated picture than than the sound bites about, find your calling, love your life, do what you love, and the money will follow. That is not that simple either. So I think to come at it for those who have the privilege, there's no one answer. There's no one size fits all. For those who do not have the privilege, that's a real, I mean, I think a societal conversation that we're maybe not in a position to influence policy as much as we would like, maybe one day. But I think that's a question of like deep importance for society that we need to get to.
Hmm. Christopher, I'd love to throw the ball into your court and ask you actually to maybe look back and help us think with a kind of philosopher's inquiry place in mind around like what can we What are some of the different ways in which philosophy has kind of helped us wrestle with this question of meaning that might be really useful kind of in today's context as we think about what meaningful work is, or might be, or ought to be?
Yeah. Well, listen, I know that you wanted a debate, and so the debate and disagreement would be even more fun. So, I'm gonna make a point for the philosopher right now,
Right.
which is that I think questions of meaning originate in philosophy. So we wouldn't be asking these questions if the philosopher at the top of the mountain, who doesn't exist, wasn't asking what is the meaning of life. There's a joke that the philosopher at the top of the mountain is waiting for the climbers to get up there so that they can tell the philosopher the meaning of life.
That's right.
But maybe philosophers were the first to ask the question. Um, and I think an important related question is, what is the good life? In fact, at St. Thomas, I'm launching a course this fall called Work and the Good Life. And we ask many of the questions that we've already talked about relating to whether work adds to or detracts from the good life. But we have to have an understanding of what the good life is. So I think one thing that philosophy can do is to sort of um, detach us from the lives that we take for granted, in which we don't get to ask the question, is work part of the good life? Because it just is part of our lives. And to ask whether it can be or ought to be part of the good life. I'm also really sensitive to the things that you both were saying about it being a privilege to ask questions like that. We don't necessarily get to choose. But another thing that philosophy and particularly ethics asks is, what are our obligations to others when it comes to not just the good life for ourselves, but the good life for the people who work for us, or who work for the people who work for us, and so on. And I think that's maybe one of the most important things that ordinary people who work can ask themselves is, what kinds of power do I have, not only to make my own work more meaningful, but also to influence the meaningfulness of the work of others? Because as I suggested with that anecdote before, sometimes people who have power in the workplace are primarily concerned about their own job satisfaction and far less concerned about that of people whose um, meaningfulness they have the power to influence, but that they don't necessarily take responsibility for.
Hmm. It makes me think so much about how organizations operate and the kinds of questions we ask in organizations, and how infrequently sitting around a boardroom table, I have encountered over the course of my career a room of executives actually asking these kinds of questions. And so, I mean, it makes me think, if we're holding these kinds of inquiries in our head around what a good life is, what are the implications in an organizational context? Like, what does that actually mean? What does an organization owe employees who are striving to do meaningful work?
So I'm thinking back to my days in management consulting, when there were executives sitting around tables talking about, what should the purpose statement of our firm be, and how do we make work more meaningful for our partners and staff. And they were asking it with a very instrumental perspective, because they knew that the emerging leaders of tomorrow cared about this. And so, in order to attract and retain them, they had to have a purpose statement, for example.
War for
And
talent. Yeah.
exactly, yeah. And not to be overly cynical about it, I think I'm actually being realistic. I think that the partners who were having this conversation really didn't themselves buy into the purpose statement that they developed, but they thought that the next generation would buy into it, because the partners had been raised in a world and been very successful in a world where increasing partner um,
Shareholder
share
value.
values
Yeah.
was the only goal. And they believed that they were very much living the good life. I also remember when the senior partner in the New York office of my former firm saw our new office that we were moving into. And the furniture or the entire layout of the office had been rearranged from our prior office that we were moving from. The old office had all the partner offices on the perimeter of the space so that they had all the windows. And the partners were never in the office because they were always traveling to clients. And so those doors were always closed, and we only had fluorescent artificial light in the office. So in the new office, they reversed the layout where the partner offices were, they had windowed doors and walls, so they were on the interior. They still got daylight, but the staff who were more often there, especially
Mhm.
the administrative assistants who were always there, they actually had access to natural light. And this partner looked at the office and he said, "Well, there goes the motivation to make partner."
Oh my God, that's amazing. Um, it makes me think about early days of the pandemic and the conversations I remember having with executives who when the pandemic impacted people in all sorts of different ways. But for many people, especially people who probably had to work in those cubicles in the office, it was an extremely liberating thing to be able to not have to go into the office, and there was all sorts of freedom and autonomy and a different way of thinking about how to structure time and to accomplish things, and people felt productive, and that there was, it was kind of magical for some, not for all. Most of the executives I remember talking to at the time were really frustrated by the experience. And when you in a few situations, I kind of dug into like what's so frustrating. When you peel that back the layers, it was, the thing that was like the thing that I remember hearing people talk about was like how annoyed they were that they couldn't wear their clothes anymore. Like they had these closets filled with gorgeous, amazing clothes that they had invested in that they couldn't wear anymore. They were so frustrated that there was nobody to like print the stuff that they needed to print. They didn't have the opportunity to literally have a door that they could close and invite people. They had to deal with this Zoom thing and like just have people, they just had to control their own Zoom. Like it was all of the vestiges of power kind of got taken away in a certain context, whereas so many privileges about the lack of power were kind of given in certain contexts. It actually changed status in ways that were really interesting. I mean, on a Zoom screen, there kind of is no hierarchy. Only one person can talk at a time. It's just an interesting. It's an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, I think that's so fascinating. What I was thinking about in as you were talking, Andrew, and actually as Christopher was talking before, was so much of that transparency, those glass walls, and wanting people in the office is about that trust. If I don't see you working, I don't trust that you're working from home, and that's another power play, right? That's another power and status kind of concern. But just this constant struggle between we'll say sort of management and staff for agency versus control. This is like the classic management paradox is
Mhm.
we want more freedom, but how do I know as I give others more freedom, including the freedom to make work more meaningful, that they're doing the job like just how I want or they're doing just what I want.
Mhm.
So I think that tension is very interesting. What
Mhm.
I was going to say about what organizations people striving to do meaningful work is just back to that, sometimes when we feel the work is deeply meaningful, we set ourselves up for exploitation. I mean, at a maybe extreme end of the spectrum in our book, when we interviewed folks, we heard from one former nonprofit attorney who worked for domestic abuse victims. And gosh, during COVID, it was a nightmare because the courts shut down and people were trapped at home with their abusers and, all these horrible, horrible things. And it actually broke this woman we interviewed who was the attorney, and she left her job without anything lined up. But she felt like what was rewarded in that work context was how much you gave up everything else to do the work. And so there was a literal awards presentation where the woman who received the award, all anyone could say was, and she never says no. And she always comes in, even when it's nights, weekends. And so we both celebrate that kind of I'm all in and I'm sacrificing everything. And because it means so much to me. And I think there's a very fine line, as others have pointed out as well, about but at what point is that not fair? So do we lean too heavily on the people who are, who we know feel the work is meaningful in a way that's not equitable? And do we ask them too much? Do we not allow them sort of any opportunity to say no or to push back or to set reasonable boundaries? And then if ultimately that burns these people out such that they can't continue, like this woman we interviewed who sort of exited completely, that's an ultimate, so maybe short-term gain for a long-term loss. So I would love organizations just to think about that.
Hmm. Okay, I want to go to something else that you were saying, Christopher, about shareholder investment. I mean, it again, and it makes me think about diving into these conversations about meaningful work. I'm sometimes confronted with organizations where, like, everything that you're suggesting, everything that you're talking about when it comes to meaningful work means spending more money on people, taking more time, reprioritizing, potentially away from kind of maximizing shareholder investment and thinking more about kind of broader stakeholder. And frankly, this is a tight market. There's tariffs all over the place. We can't manage that. We have to manage to the bottom line. And so I guess my broad, big scope question, and either of you can decide who wants to go first. Are we being delusional when we're talking about meaningful work in a neoliberal, late capitalist society?
Well, when we were getting acquainted before we started recording, Andrew, you talked about the hope that work could be conducive to well-being, and the question of whether that hope actually was well-founded. I'm guessing that you wouldn't be persisting with your work for so long if you didn't actually have that optimism that we're not being delusional, that there is hope. And I would like to think of myself as an optimist and to believe that people really are genuine when they talk about the opportunity to develop relationships and to find some sense of fulfillment in their work. I do think that we do have tremendous capacity for self-deception in order to get by in those respects. And so we have to be very careful that we're not rationalizing our own sense of meaningfulness. But I think that I still don't really understand what the term late capitalism means, because it implies that it's about to end and that the next thing's coming, but I haven't heard anybody say what the next thing is.
It's true.
Um, yeah. So wherever we are in capitalism, you know, it's not that different from early capitalism in the pin factory described in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. We are still engaged in a struggle to get work done efficiently and serve short-term objectives, while also recognizing that employment is a long-term need and a long-term commitment, and that long-term employee satisfaction can be conducive to short-term profitability.
So I wonder if the next stage is just the robots take our jobs and then we're back to Aristotle's, we're free from work.
What
to
are we
live
going
our
to do
best
with all this
lives.
leisure time?
Yeah,
Right.
we're living our best lives, pursuing the liberal arts and living fully outside of work, right?
Okay.
Maybe that's it.
Okay,
Uh,
great. So you've just given me, of course, the next prompt, which I have to go to, which is David Graeber's wonderful essay on bullshit jobs, the phenomenon of bullshit jobs, which I think he published in 2013. So it's already, and of course, David Graeber passed away a few years ago. I love his work. But the opening paragraph of this essay, which I just want to read in full because it's so wonderful, just literally gets at exactly what you just described. So he starts this essay, which he wrote in 2013. In the year 1930, John Maynard Keynes predicted that by century's end, so the end of the 20th century, technology would have advanced sufficiently that countries like Great Britain or the United States would have achieved a 15-hour work week. There's every reason to believe he was right in technological terms. We are quite capable of this, even more capable of this today than we were in 2013. And yet, it didn't happen. Instead, technology has been marshaled, if anything, to figure out ways to make us all work more. In order to achieve this, jobs have had to be created that are effectively pointless. Huge swaths of people spend their entire working lives performing tasks that secretly they believe do not really need to be performed. The moral and spiritual damage that comes from this situation is profound. It's a scar across our collective soul, yet virtually no one talks about it. First, any comments?
Well, I teach a class at Babson with a film professor on the nature, culture, and future of work. And we show students the film Office Space, which any one of, I'm going to say broadly, our generation, okay, of folks on the call, I'm going to put us squarely in like the Gen X cohort, remembers as the depiction of bullshit jobs. And one of my favorite lines in that whole film is when they bring in the consultants and they're interviewing everybody. And one of them says, "What would you say it is you do here?" And the guy can't even explain, right? Make sure the paper gets from here to here, and that's my job, And they're like, "But we don't understand," right? So, and we see the protagonist of Office Space who literally has under hypnosis and existential crisis and decides the best thing he can do for his life is to quit work entirely. And then because it's a hilarious movie, he ends up getting a promotion and the consultants love him and see him as leadership potential. So it's just it's so perfect. And for our students, they think it's as the kids today say, low key funny. Like they don't think it's as hilarious as I think our generation maybe viewed it. They feel immense sympathy for the character of Milton with the red stapler who keeps getting shuffled around to lower and lower levels. And they keep saying, why are they so mean to him? And this is he's having a wellness crisis and who's there for him. And right. So it's just I think my students, what I see them wanting, the next generation, more than almost anything else, is to feel like they are healthy, thriving, whole people. Like their wellness is the baseline. It's like the oxygen mask metaphor. They can't do anything else or contribute anything else if that's not taken care of. So when we talked earlier about the war for talent, I think that's an important factor is
Agreed.
like, do people feel not just that their jobs sort of hopefully aren't bullshit, but that they are a place where individuals can thrive? I think that's maybe the hope. We'll see. Again, I think we're not quite there yet. Christopher, I want to let you jump in.
Well, there's so much that I want to respond to. Number one, I've done bullshit jobs. I believe in bullshit jobs, and yet I think part of the reason that we haven't achieved the elimination of those in 15% or 15 hour a week work schedules is that there are two sides to the workforce. One is the labor side, and then the other is the consumer side. And as consumers, we get more and more demanding, and so we demand more and more work in order to get our improved outcomes or outcomes that we perceive as improved, even if they aren't necessarily. All the things that we can do in our lives that we weren't able to do when John Maynard Keynes was actually writing. Jen, I know your kids are younger than mine, but my understanding of low key is different than yours. So I think low key funny is actually the highest praise. Like they even think it's funnier than you might think it is. I've never seen Office Spaces. Jen laments often because she's recommended it to me a million times. But that um, that comment that you made, what do you really do here, reminded me so much of Elon Musk asking federal employees, what do you
Completely.
really do here?
Yeah.
And on one hand, it can mean, well, if you can't answer that question, you must have a bullshit job. On the other hand, being asked that question uh, is just such an insult to people who are really committed to the idea that public interest is a public trust, and um, who are actually working for a higher purpose to improve the function of the federal government to serve people. So I think that jobs that look from the outside like bullshit jobs sometimes might actually be really important jobs from the inside.
Hmm. As you think about the future of work, and you're talking both about kind of future generations, whether students, your kids, as we think about the rise of generative AI and the ways in which it is transforming what work is, what are your greatest hopes for meaning and purpose when it comes to the future of work?
I mean, I think all of our great hope for generative AI in particular is that it will automate what we find meaningless and therefore leave what we find meaningful. I think the scary part then of generative AI is that there's no guarantee that that is actually how things are going to play out. And again, if I may invoke my psychologist view of the subjective nature of work, there's a documentary called The Future of Work and Death that's got a lot of very interesting things in it. And they interview a long haul truck driver and basically say, with self driving trucks, what does this mean to your job? And he says, basically, my job is everything. It is my life. I will drive, forever. I intend to die in my truck, is the statement. And so we will undoubtedly automate or replace jobs that meant something to people. This goes back to Christopher's point about it may not feel like a bullshit job to the person holding it.
Sure.
So I just think that's something that we want to think about because we do not know in our current society how to not work. I don't even think we know what that means to have that much leisure time. And so I think yes, there's a long there's a long way to go between where we are now and what that future would look like, which is why I think it's so scary.
There's a long way to go, and yet a lot of so-called self-proclaimed futurists are already talking about the end of work. And it's getting a lot of headlines, and some of them are celebrating the idea of the end of work, to free us up for what Jen referred to as Aristotle's life of leisure. But the life of leisure is still full of work. It's just sort of higher order work. Um, Meanwhile, though, I actually don't believe the end of work will ever come because I believe that humans are a working species. We will always find things to do. And my optimism is that there are some things that human beings can do that AI will never be able to do. And that in particular involves being creative and being caring. I know that AI can appear creative and it can make pretty pictures. It can even write entertaining mystery novels, but it can't write War and Peace. And it can't replace a loved one. And those who think it can don't really understand what it is to be beautiful and what it is to be loved. And I was talking with a fiction writer the other day about a conversation that's being had in that world about using AI to write fiction. And people were up in arms in this conversation. And we agreed that ultimately the only defense that human creativity has against AI creativity is to be more creative, to up our game, to actually use AI to make our work more creative and more caring. And so that's where my optimism comes from.
I'm very happy to end on that optimistic note. And before we wrap up, I mean, there's so much, there's so many wonderful topics that we could have talked about that we didn't today that fill the pages of both of your recent books. If people want to learn more about either of your work and specifically read your books, where would you point them?
Well, one of us has a website, so they can find me at christopherwongmichaelson.com. And there's information about both of us and our books there. We're also both on LinkedIn.
Wonderful. We'll make sure that we put links to both of the books. One is more popular press if you want to like bring it into work and talk about it. One is more academic if you're interested in kind of wrestling with this and potentially bringing it into a classroom. Both are just wonderful. Thank you both so much today for the challenges, the wisdom, the questions, the interdisciplinarity. You've given us so much to think about. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It's really been a fun conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Meaningful Work Matters. If you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. And if this episode resonated with you, please take a moment to leave us a review. Your feedback helps us make this podcast better and reach more listeners. You can connect with me, Andrew Soren, on LinkedIn, or visit www.eubd.ca to learn more about Eudaimonic by Design. Finally, if what you heard today spoke to you, tell your colleagues and people in your community about our podcast. We really appreciate your support in making meaningful work matter. See you next time.